vibratory behavior of the vocal folds. So we're going to go through each muscle separately. We're going to talk about what it does in terms of phonation, its general function, and then the effect that it has on phonation. These are the muscles that most people associate with laryngeal function, as opposed to the extrinsic laryngeal muscles, which kind of, their general function is to affect the position of the larynx in the neck and can change the general tension of laryngeal structure, but it's the intrinsic laryngeal muscles that we mostly talk about as related to phonation. Okay, so the first one is called the cricothyroid muscle. So where does the muscle run from? The cricoid cartilage to the thyroid cartilage. Right, and as soon as you looked at this slide, you said, oh, there is an anterior view of the larynx, or oh, there is a lateral view of the larynx. You should recognize these, views just like that, with a click of the finger. Okay. It's a paired muscle, which means it lies on the right side of the larynx and the left side of the larynx, so it's a paired muscle. And you can see the two pairs, one on the left, one on the right. And there's also two parts to this muscle. So one part is outlined in that reddish color and the other one kind of blue. Okay, so we say that these muscles are located on the ventral outer surface of the larynx. So I'm saying it's located on the front outer surface of the larynx. And you can see that the connection obviously is going to go from the bottom of the thyroid cartilage to the arch of the cricoid cartilage, right? That's where they are. The first part of the muscle, or the first portion of the muscle, is called the ventral or the straight portion. The Latin name for that is the pars recta, and that one is outlined in red right here because it's more vertical than the pars oblique, which is the second portion. So these muscle fibers run a little bit more obliquely than the straight portion of the muscle. Okay, the origin of both of them is the arch of the cricoid cartilage, so right here and right here, the arch of the cricoid cartilage. And notice how they sweep upward and insert into the caudal margin of the thyroid cartilage. I mean, the only other thing you could add to that is it's really on that inferior outside portion of that thyroid cartilage. Okay, now, you have this anterior view. The lateral view is showing you the left pair, the left-sided pair of the cricothyroid muscle. Now, this is the muscle that is responsible for rotating the thyroid cartilage down in the front. If you remember that picture, the front of the thyroid cartilage, if you keep your eye on this part of the cartilage, it'll rotate the front down. And then what happens, remember those arytenoid cartilages right here on the back, and the vocal folds attach to that vocal process. And if this muscle contracts and tips the front of the thyroid kind of down and forward, that will lengthen the vocal fold. And if you lengthen the vocal fold, that puts additional tension onto the vocal fold. And if you tense the vocal fold, you increase the fundamental frequency. Yes?
On the other slide that you gave us, I don't know which slide, but there's two arrows. There's one that pulls the muscles down.
Pulls the thyroid cartilage
but this
down?
But this isn't the same muscle that pulls the other cartilage anterior, right? Or
The arytenoid cartilage? Are you talking about the arytenoid cartilage then?
I remember you drew two arrows, like one down and then one across. Is this the same muscle that
I
pulls?
don't remember. Can you show me that drawing and then you show it to me? I will remember. And I don't know which arrows we're talking about. Could it be at the other joint? because this is the rotation of the thyroid cartilage around the cricothyroid joint. Were we talking about the other joint, which is the cricoarytenoid joint? Let me see. Oh, yes, it does that. Okay, so the picture she's talking about is in the one laryngeal anatomy slide. And it's in the section on movements at the laryngeal joints. I can go back to that. It must be way at the end. Well, I should have gone some different way. It's that one, right? Okay, so the question is it this muscle? Yes, this is the cricothyroid muscle, which if you look at, let's look at this one right here, because that's this one or the bottom one. And this is the arytenoid cartilage sitting on top of the back of the cricoid, so there is a shadow cartilage. You can't really see it if you have this view, okay? And then remember the vocal folds attached to the inside of the thyroid cartilage right there. So before it's tipped down, the cricothyroid muscle then attaches to the cricoid arch and the front of the thyroid right about here. So that's the one that's going to pull down on the thyroid cartilage and lengthen the vocal fold when it contracts. Okay, that's that one. Okay, any questions about this? All right, so the second muscle is called posterior cricoarytenoid muscle. So the posterior is telling you that it's going to be on the posterior aspect of the larynx, and that it's going to run between the two attachment points are going to be cricoid cartilage and the arytenoid cartilage. And so as soon as you see this picture, you say, oh, okay, there's a view of the posterior aspect of the larynx and those laryngeal cartilages. And for the general location, the muscle that we're talking about is this muscle right here. It's the bilateral muscle. One, now in this case, since we're looking at the back, this is the left. This is the right pair, right part of the pair. And you can see that the origin of the muscle is the lamina, right along here on each side, the lamina of the cricoid cartilage. Here's the origin of the muscle along those two lines. And then notice how the muscle fibers sweep upward and converge onto, you can't actually see where they're converging, but I'm telling you that they are converging on the posterior aspect of the muscular process of the arytenoid cartilage on each side, right? Muscular process here and muscular process right there. So that's it. So now you picture these muscle fibers. Cricoid cartilage is stable. The muscle fibers contract and shorten, and they're going to pull kind of back and down on the muscular process. They're going to pull back and down on the muscular process. So now your job is visualize what's going to happen to the vocal processes of each of those arytenoid cartilages. Are they going to be pulled to the midline, or are they going to be pulled laterally? Yes, the vocal processes are going to be pulled laterally, and so therefore, this muscle, the posterior cricoarytenoid muscle, is a main vocal fold opener. So in other words, it abducts the arytenoid cartilage, and the vocal folds, of course, are carried along with that arytenoid cartilage. And so this muscle is referred to as the primary vocal fold abductor. The primary vocal fold abductor. Now, if I can't show you the muscle attachment, but basically the effect, if these are your two arytenoid cartilage, base of the arytenoid cartilage, vocal process is pulling forward. Here's your muscular process on each side, and that muscle kind of pulls like this on the base of the muscular process, and so it has that effect. So what's it doing? It's going to open the vocal folds. Remember, the vocal folds are attached, they're running forward. So this is the posterior cricoarytenoid is your main vocal fold abductor. Okay. The third muscle, and there are two parts of the muscle, are referred to as just the arytenoid muscles. Sometimes you might hear them called the interarytenoid muscles. Many times people will refer to them as the interarytenoid muscles. Now the muscles that we're talking about then, if they're called the interarytenoid or the arytenoid muscles, these muscles are running from one arytenoid cartilage to the other arytenoid cartilage. So they run, the muscles pair run between the arytenoid cartilages. So you look at the figure, and once again you say, okay, this is the general location of the arytenoid cartilages right here. You can see here's the cricoid lamina. Here is part of the thyroid cartilage. Here are those arytenoid muscles that we're talking about right now. So they lie really, this is the posterior aspect of the larynx. So they run between those two arytenoid cartilages on the back of the arytenoid cartilages. On the back of the arytenoid cartilages. Okay, so let's talk about the two parts now. The first part of the muscle is referred to as the transverse arytenoid muscle. Transverse because the muscle fibers basically run in a transverse direction, a horizontal transverse direction. And you can see them on this slide. They're right underneath this X pattern. That's the next part of the muscle. But the transverse arytenoids, if you follow the little green dot, they're running transversely. Really, if you look at what I say, it's a single muscle originating from the apex to the base of one of the arytenoid cartilages. So this is the origin, and then the fibers run horizontally and attach from the apex to the base of the other arytenoid cartilage. So even without me telling you, if those muscle fibers contract and shorten, what's it going to do to the arytenoid cartilage? It's going to pull the whole cartilage to the midline, and then what will that do to the vocal folds? It will abduct the vocal folds. They'll be carried to the midline also. Now, the second part of the arytenoid muscle is called the oblique arytenoid muscle. And you can see, I'm just going to show it to you, because first look at where the muscle is. It's still on the back of the arytenoid cartilage, and it's forming this X pattern. Okay? So they're paired, slender muscles that are forming that X pattern, again, on the posterior aspect of those two arytenoid cartilages. And they're superficial, or in other words, more towards the outside of the larynx, the outside of the body than the transverse, so that's why you're seeing that X pattern on top of the transverse portion. So it runs from the apex of one arytenoid cartilage and then crosses the midline and inserts onto the base of the opposite arytenoid cartilage. So if you look at this, the origin is the apex of one arytenoid cartilage. It crosses over and attaches to the base of the opposite arytenoid cartilage. And there's two of them, so they form that X pattern. Again, the function of both of these parts of the arytenoid muscles is to abduct the arytenoid cartilages. The whole cartilage will be moved toward the midline, which will carry the vocal folds with it, and the vocal folds will be closed or adducted, ADD. Okay, the fourth muscle is called the lateral cricoarytenoid muscle. I've got a couple different pictures. I like this one here, right? Because you can visualize where the muscle is and what it's doing. This is a schematic of the lateral cricoarytenoid muscle. You're viewing it, you made a cut like this, you made a transverse cut. And then you have the next muscle immediately lateral to the vocal ligament is called the thyrovocalis muscle. Sometimes it's referred to, the more formal name of this muscle is the internal thyroarytenoid muscle, because the muscle runs where from the arytenoid cartilage to the interior aspect of the thyroid cartilage. Internal, meaning it's more towards the middle of the vocal fold. Whereas the next part of the vocal fold, and is also a muscle, is the thyrovocalis muscle. And that's referred to as the external thyroarytenoid muscle. It's more away from the medial, it's more towards the lateral aspects of the larynx, and so that's why it's called external thyroarytenoid muscle. Most of these times when you're reading studies, they group those two muscles together and they're referred to as the thyroarytenoid muscles, or the TA muscles. All of these muscles have abbreviations. Okay, so those two parts of the thyroarytenoid muscles are called the TA muscles. Now in this one, it's just another view of the same thing. So here you have the thyroid cartilage. Here are those two arytenoid cartilages, here and here. Here's your vocal process, here and here. Here's the muscular process. Now look at how the vocal folds attach. I like this one because it gives you, you can kind of see the depth of the vocal. You get some attachment of the vocal ligament in this view to that vocal process. You can see where the thyrovocalis muscle is. And then you have the thyromuscularis, which lies lateral to the vocalis. So the vocal folds are not just made up of the vocal ligament or this kind of skinny cord of tissue. They actually have part of the makeup of the vocal fold is a ligament, which is the conus elasticus, and we call it the vocal ligament at that point. And you have two muscles that make up the vocal folds. But there are also some other layers. When we look at the video in a couple minutes, you have a skin layer over the vocal folds, right? The skin that holds the whole thing together. And there's really a mucosal layer on top of that, and there's some other connective tissue that covers the vocal folds. So we're going to look at that. Well, let's just finish this kind of traditional view. We're going to look at the layer structure in just a minute. So I have the conus elasticus or the vocal ligament outlined in blue right here, showing you that it's forming the medial edge, and then we have an opening between the vocal folds. It's referred to as the glottis. The origin is the vocal process of the arytenoid cartilage. Now what did I do? The picture just flipped on you guys. Did you realize that? Like right away. Okay, so now the arytenoid cartilages are at the back, or the posterior aspect of the glottis is at the bottom. The thyroid cartilage is at the top, and so this is anterior at the top. Okay, origin of the vocal ligament is the vocal process of arytenoid cartilage inserts into the thyroid cartilage, that internal aspect immediately below the thyroid notch. And the vocal ligament is a ligament, so it can't contract by itself. Only muscles can contract.
What's the black part of the?
The black part of it is the conus elasticus.
I thought that was the vocal ligament.
It's part of the vocal ligament. The conus elasticus forms the vocal ligament. So the conus elasticus is sweeping up from the inside of the laryngeal cartilages and going like this. So the black part you're seeing is this part that's going like that. And then the vocal ligament's right at the midline. But it is part of the conus elasticus. The question is, can you interchange those terms? Yeah. Depending on how I ask it. Yes. Okay, so the vocal ligament isn't a muscle, therefore it can't really contract, but it gets passively stretched or compressed. You know, it gets carried along when the muscles function. Right. Now, the thyrovocalis muscle, another good picture of, you know, where these are. So if the vocal ligament is most medial, that's outlined in black, here's the thyrovocalis. So it's just lateral to the ligament. And origin, again, notice how it's kind of a broad origin on the vocal process on each side. And then inserts into the thyroid notch, the thyroid lamina right below the notch. And then again, the thyromuscularis is outlined in red on this one, so it's lateral to the vocalis on each side. Origin is the thyroid angle, insertion into what's referred to as the anterolateral surface of the vocal process, and also the muscular process. And of course, it's bilateral. So this is a nice picture of the mass of the vocal folds. You can't see the depth, but you can imagine that there, of course, is some depth to the vocal folds also. Yeah.
So the thyroid angle is like the side of
The thyroid angle, I mean, if you look at that thyroid cartilage right here, I remember the notch, it dips down a little bit. So they're inserting right below the thyroid notch on the inside. Because they're coming from the back and inserting the inside of the thyroid angle. No. This is where it gets, it's not confusing, but it's such a traditional view, I have to present it. The question was, is the vocal ligament just the edge? It actually is a layer of the vocal folds, and so some of it's on the top and around the bottom also, but that's the next view that we're gonna take. Okay? Let's just skip this for a minute. I'm gonna come back to this. Okay. This is, when somebody says it's a histologic structure of any structure, it's a very detailed view of the internal structure of a structure, you know? And so what we're looking at right now is a vocal fold. It's one vocal fold. And so let me just outline this one, so that you know what you're looking at. This is the top of one vocal fold. This is the medial edge of that same vocal fold, and then you can't see the bottom, but it would be down here. So this is lateral, and this is medial. This would be the glottis. The air would be coming up through here between that vocal fold. What? Okay, this is the top of the vocal fold. This is the medial edge of the vocal fold all the way down, and then the bottom is kind of cut off, but the bottom of the vocal fold would be like that. So if you were breathing and you were looking at this one vocal fold, it's a coronal view, it's a frontal view. So the cut is like this, and they cut through the vocal folds in this direction. So this is the top, the medial edge, the air would move up through here, and the other vocal fold would be over here, right? The other vocal fold would be over here. So what this section is showing you is kind of the detailed aspect of the layer structure of the vocal fold, because again, they have some mass. It's a very complex structure, and so it creates a complex vibratory pattern. And therefore, it also creates a complex tone because of the complex vibration. That's why, if you've been in are you guys in psychoacoustics? Is that next semester? Or phonetics, and has she mentioned this term quasi-periodic tone yet? You guys aren't to that point. Okay. So anyhow, we don't produce a pure tone with our vocal folds. If you hit a tuning fork on a table, you get a pure tone. The tone that we get at the level of the vocal folds when the vocal folds vibrate is more like a buzzer or sounding tone. It's a very complex vibration. And it's because it's a complex structure and a complex vibration. So that's why it's important to know this layer structure. So anyhow, if you look at this closely, you see these different colors. So this is a real vocal fold that has been excised from a human body. And then they stain the vocal folds with different chemicals and different layers, because they take up the stain differently, are different colors, all right? So what you're looking at right here is the epithelial layer. And you see that that's kind of an orangey color, and then there's another layer underneath that that's kind of lavender, and here's another layer that's more like red. And then you have, and some of the layers kind of meld together, they're not always very distinct depending on the person. And then this layer in here is the muscle layer. So let's go through those 5 layers. So the vocal folds are comprised of both non-muscular tissue and muscular tissue, right? So you've got all of this connective tissue, some is muscular and some is non-muscular. The most superficial layer, or out towards the outside of the vocal fold, is the epithelial layer, which is a thin shell of skin. Epithelial cells are skin cells. And basically that, wow, what was that just flew across? It was a bee. You know, when we were in Diefendorf one year, this was a great class, there were not only bees, because you know, Diefendorf has those doors to the outside, and the maintenance people would leave the doors open. And we had a class that was about this size, there were 120 students, and all of a sudden one of the students says, "There's a mouse in the room." It was like, oh my God. So what happened was everybody got up on their chairs and got their feet up. I said, you know, it's just a mouse, you guys. It's, you know, a lot smaller than you. But it took over class for, I don't know, 15 minutes. Finally, one of the students in the class, it was a woman, got up and caught the mouse and put it outside. So that was our... Now, why did I say that? The bee. Oh, the bee triggered that memory. So, yeah. So we have the outside layer, which is the, I mean, I have some other stories I can tell also. The epithelial layer is that skin layer. Then right underneath the epithelial layer, or deep to the epithelial layer, is a layer that has been named the superficial layer of the mucosa. So there's actually a mucus covering of the vocal folds, okay? And this layer is this lavender one right in here. See, it's all, you guys make sure to print out the big pictures. This is the superficial layer of the mucosa, which is part of another structure that's called the lamina propria. It's the cover of the vocal. Okay, then immediately deep to that is, it all makes sense. It's superficial, intermediate, deep, and then the muscle. So these 5 layers: skin, superficial layer, intermediate layer, deep layer, muscle. So the superficial layer are kind of loosely packed fibers, and it's referred to as Ranke space, which is an interesting space to identify. So you have these loosely packed fibers, so it didn't take up the stain the same way as the lighter color. And Ranke, so it's kind of a space because it's not really tightly packed. And it's this space that when you have something like laryngitis or some other condition that might retain fluid, and so you can get Ranke's edema, which is a swelling of the vocal folds, and you get that fluid in there, and the fluid stays for a long time. It actually forms this kind of a gelatinous type polyp that can form in the area. But when you guys get laryngitis, anybody have laryngitis right now? But you've had it, right? We've all had it at one time or another. And sometimes you get, you know, you get acute laryngitis, and what happens is the vocal folds kind of swell up and they can't vibrate when they're swollen like that. And so if they can't vibrate, you can't produce a tone, and if you don't have a tone, you don't have voice. And so that's laryngitis. That tends to happen in Ranke space, which is the superficial layer of the vocal folds immediately underneath the skin. Then you have the intermediate layer of the mucosa, which consists, again, of elastic fibers, but not muscular fibers. So the intermediate layer, if you just follow your arrows through, are right about here. Look at that, right in there. You can follow these layers around the top of the vocal folds, the bottom of the vocal folds, the superficial along the top, the medial edge, you know, would be the bottom. The skin along the top, medial edge, and just going to the bottom. Okay. So now the deep layer of the mucosa is, again, consists of these fibers that are, these are collagenous fibers, which tend to be more protein. They're likened to a layer of cotton thread, so they're kind of soft fibers, and this deep layer right here is right along here, right underneath the superficial. And then notice that the deepest layer is the muscle. So if we're looking for the vocalis, it's right about here, right? The vocalis muscle is going to be more intermediate. And then the muscularis will be deeper, a little more lateral. This way. Okay, now, so those are how it's described as the layer structure of the vocal fold. And then there was one researcher that did this. This is taken from a book that's called, the authors are Hirano and Sato. He's a really famous Japanese researcher that does work in anatomy and histologic structure of the larynx and also some voice science research. And this is from his book. Now, here's that same slide. I just reproduced it again. And so again, we're looking at the layer structure of the vocal fold. But then he goes on to talk about the lamina propria, which most people, which constitutes that kind of moist lining that we know as mucous membranes. If you look at the inside of your cheeks and your oral cavity and your tongue and the walls of your pharynx and the vocal folds, they have this very moist lining known as mucous membranes or mucosa. So the lamina propria is part of that mucosa. And by definition, by his definition, the lamina propria consists of the superficial layer, the intermediate layer, and the deep layers. Okay? So the superficial, intermediate, and the deep, all the way around. Now this is what I want you to pay attention to in terms of the vocal ligament. The vocal ligament itself, right, so we're talking about these are all non-muscular layers, is defined as consisting of the intermediate and the deep layers together. So if you look at and follow around the intermediate and the deep layer, notice that that vocal ligament layer, right, both the intermediate and the deep form part of the top of the vocal fold, and you can follow it down along the medial edge. And you could follow it down to the bottom. So the conus elasticus is really sweeping up to form part of this layer structure, but it's also part of the top and the bottom of the vocal fold. So the vocal ligament is a little more complex than what's depicted in that previous slide. Okay, now the two muscles, the two thyroarytenoid muscles, remember it's the vocalis and the muscularis. That's what constitutes the main body of the vocal folds, because the muscles of the vocal folds, the vocalis and the muscularis, have the biggest mass of the vocal folds. But they are muscles, and so therefore the stiffness of the body of the vocal folds, the main body of the vocal folds is made up by muscle, and muscle can contract. So if anything contracts in the vocal folds, it's that muscle. And then what happens to the other layers? They're still there. So let's say that, just so you can visualize this, let's say you contract both the vocalis and the muscularis, and the way you contract them causes them to shorten, kind of bunch up and get, shorter but bunchy looking from front to back. What's going to happen to those? The skin, the superficial, the intermediate, and the deep layer of the vocal folds. Are they going to get tense or are they going to get less tense? Less tense. They'll get kind of slack. If you shorten the vocal folds and bunch them up, the lamina propria, the vocal ligament, get more slack. And so you can have this kind of interesting case where you make the muscles more stiff, but you make the cover of the vocal fold more slack, and they can vibrate differently depending on, the tension of the cover. Whereas if you lengthen the vocal folds, right? Let's say that you go to a really high fundamental frequency, you lengthen the vocal folds. What's going to happen to the cover of the vocal folds? Stiffer or more? Yeah, the cover is going to get stretched too, and so therefore the cover will get stiffer, and the cover will vibrate as a stiffer structure along with the muscle. So, you always have to visualize, you know, how the muscle is contracted and then what's gonna happen to the cover. And, because the cover is non-muscular, the lamina propria is non-muscular, whereas, the body of the vocal fold is a muscle. But that's why we have that complex vibration, and, you know, when people change their pitch, or they go to a different register for the singers that might use falsetto, or when I do something like I've demonstrated glottal fry for you, you know, you get a very, very different vibratory pattern, and so therefore a different tone. And of course, we're controlling all of that. Okay, now, again, by Hirano's classification, I kind of wish they would have made it simpler. Those 5 layers are classified into three sections. This actually gets talked about a lot. The cover is really referred to, the cover is referred to as being that epithelial layer and the superficial layer. The transition of the vocal folds is the intermediate and deep layer, or in other words, the vocal ligament. And the body are the 2 thyroarytenoid muscles. It's it's straightforward. Now, these are just a matter of learning it. And then, so the vocal fold is a really complex structure. What's interesting, and I will talk about this when we get to the next section of the course, is you're born without a vocal ligament. Your ligament and the conus elasticus is not completely developed in the vocal folds. And you don't get a mature vocal ligament until you're about 18 or 20. So it takes a while for different structures to totally mature in the human body. Okay, so here you go. This is a concept that's really stressed when you're studying the anatomy of the larynx, and that is, I've been talking about it, the vocal folds are a multi-layer vibrator. They vibrate, that's what creates our sound source during speech production and for voice production. And it ends up being a really important factor for how our voices sound. And I've said this in so many different words right now, but basically, the mechanical properties of the cover and the transition of the vocal folds are passively controlled, meaning they can't contract themselves. We've talked about this. Whereas the body of the vocal fold is a muscle, and therefore it can be actively controlled. So you actively control the contraction of, the contraction of the thyroarytenoid muscles, as well as the other intrinsic muscles of the larynx that we've been talking about. So, but you can't actively control the cover and transition. I think that should be the last slide, but wait a minute, we're going to go right back to this one. Okay, so now that you have a good visual picture, a good visual concept of the vocal folds and how they run, you know, from the arytenoid cartilages to the inside of the thyroid, you have a visual picture of the non-muscular parts of the vocal fold and the muscular parts. So here's the problem about, people really wonder, there's so many different functions that are talked about in relation to the thyroarytenoid muscles, or those 2, the vocalis and the muscularis. But nobody really knows for sure how they function, all right? And the reason is, the only real way you can tell how a muscle functions is by doing an EMG study, an electromyographic study of the vocal folds. And we've talked about that before, remember? You stick a needle or electrode into a muscle. You can tell when that individual muscle is contracting and what it's responsible for. But if you put, let's say that we got one of those nice little hook wire electrodes and we stuck it into the body of the vocal fold, and then we told the person, some people are grossed out by this, but it doesn't, you wouldn't feel, it's not bad, not good, it's not too bad. You tell a person to start phonating, so you want them to change their fundamental frequency, and you want to see if the thyroarytenoid muscles, the vocalis or the muscularis, are contracting. Or you tell a person to talk really loud, is the TA contracting or not contracting? You tell someone to close their, tightly abduct their vocal folds, which you can do on command. Does the TA contract or not contract? So you can have a person do different things and then mark the activity. But as soon as the vocal folds start vibrating, okay, picture that little hook wire electrode in the vocal folds and they start vibrating. And, you know, my fundamental frequency is probably about 200 hertz, which means they're vibrating 200 times per second. You get what's referred to as a movement artifact. So the vocal folds could be vibrating, but the muscles aren't necessarily contracting. But it'll look like they're contracting just because they're moving. So you can't study the TA muscles. Every time you study the TA muscles, you get a movement artifact. So nobody really knows. I mean, the limited data that we have on the thyroarytenoid muscles in terms of their function, because we haven't really talked about their function yet, is that if you contract the external portion, which would be the muscularis, that might pull the arytenoid cartilages forward towards the thyroid, and maybe it would take the tension out of the thyrovocalis muscle and the cover, right? And so maybe that could have the effect of, might have the effect of lowering your fundamental frequency, right? If you bunch up the vocalis and it gets kind of slack and the cover gets slack, you might lower your fundamental frequency. But another hypothesis is that if you contract those thyroarytenoid muscles together, you can increase the internal tension of the muscle. And if you increase the tension, you actually get an increase in the fundamental frequency. And the other hypothesis is that the muscle just doesn't do anything active. We just let it sit there and it vibrates passively and you can't control anything with it. Now, write the fourth one in. The fourth one is that the thyroarytenoid muscles contract and they kind of bunch up the vocal folds and they help close the vocal folds. Because if they're bunchier, they'd go towards the midline and that could help close the vocal folds. So the thyroarytenoid muscles can also be associated with closure of the vocal folds as well as fundamental frequency changes. So they're all hypotheses. We don't know absolutely for sure. Could I just what? Rewrite the point and then load it up onto UB Learn? Oh, re-say it. Okay, yeah, I can say it. The fourth hypothesis is the two muscles contract together, basically. The thyroarytenoid muscles contract, it bunches up the muscle, and it helps to close it, because they go more to the midline. So they bunch, they move towards the midline, they help with closure. Yes.
Can you put this picture up on UB Learns in color so we can look at it and study better, because it's only up in black and white?
I might be able to do that. Yeah,
Okay.
I have it in color, so I can do that. Okay. Anything else? Okay, why don't we take a little transition period? Those of you that want to leave right now, you can leave. Oh no, Dick can't leave, sorry. I'm going to show my videos. Because these are important anatomically.